Hey guys, good morning, good evening, good favorite part of the day. Let's talk about an interesting concept. Hypercorrection. What in the world is that? And I'm sorry if I'm speaking a little quietly. Hopefully my simultaneous interpreter headphone does the trick. But I think my dear neighbors in Mexico City would not appreciate a loud clip at 2 a.m. in the morning. But I just had to do this for you, For you and for me. Before I have my apple and watch an episode of Outlander, I have to do something helpful for the world for a change. But okay, speaking of worlds and of hypercorrection, take a look at this puzzle piece map behind me. Like, this is supposed to be the Atlantic Ocean, but I think it's hypercorrectedly big proportionately to the other puzzle pieces. I'm no geographer, it just seems so, right? But what is actually hypercorrection? For once, I actually agree with Wikipedia, so I'm going to read you the definition, and then we'll go through some examples. Deal? In life and in linguistics. So it says, in social linguistics, hypercorrection is the non-standard use of language that results from the over-application of a perceived rule, of language usage prescription. A speaker-writer who produces a hypercorrection generally believes, through a misunderstanding of such rules, that the form or phrase they use is more correct, standard, or otherwise preferable, often combined with a desire to appear formal or educated. Linguistic hypercorrection occurs when a real or imagined grammatical rule is applied in an inappropriate context, this crucial context, so that an attempt to be correct leads to an incorrect result. It does not occur when a speaker follows a natural speech instinct, according to Otto Jespersen, Norwegian, I guess, maybe a Swede, and Robert J. Menner. Hypercorrection can be found among speakers of less prestigious language varieties who attempt to produce forms associated with high prestige varieties, even in situations where speakers of those varieties would not. What does that mean? Because it sounds complex. It means people who usually speak lower register language, or maybe are not as profusely educated, would actually try to use more quote-unquote proper language than people who are more erudite because they don't need to. That's what it means. Some commentators call such production hyperurbanism. Hypercorrection can occur in many languages and wherever multiple languages or language varieties are in contact. And because I'm a huge buff of etymologies, I'm going to tell you that hyper comes from Greek huper, over and beyond, so too much, and correct comes from Latin corrigere, from core together, and regere to guide. So correcting someone or something is actually supposed to guide them. Okay, examples in life. This is akin to, but not necessarily the same, as something I like to call the pendulum effect, right? If we have, here, let me imitate a pendulum, and somebody is at this end of the spectrum, and it's incorrect, you tell them to swing here to the golden middle, but instead they go, right, instead of the middle. Like, I'm also a running coach. We get this in running when we teach people that they should fall. Literally, like they should run at an angle. They basically start falling like this, or bending from the hip, or like way overdoing it. Or if we tell them to pull their foot from the ground, they start kicking themselves in the butt, like they way overdo it. Right? I actually even remember discussing this with the founder of my running technique, Dr. Romanov. And I said, well, because, when a person runs, all of their body parts are supposed to be on one line. And having your foot behind your body is a mistake. So I saw that like half or 1/4 of the foot was behind. And I was like, Dr. Romanov, isn't that a mistake? He was like, whatever, it's not a big deal, That's actually also a part of judgment, knowing when a mistake is crucial or when it isn't. Lest I forget, let me give you an example. And that is actually maybe an example of hypercorrection. But I showed the rendition of a song of a very talented singer and a friend of mine, her name is Katya, to another vocal coach, and the other vocal coach was like, she's off, she's false, she's not even a professional, you know. And I stood up for her, and you should always do that. You should stand up for your friends, especially if it's not true, because I've seen Katya work, and she's extremely professional. We all make mistakes. I can make a mistake in interpretation, though it's better not. But when she works, she corrects herself, she pays the most meticulous attention to details. And when I told her, she laughed and she was like, huh, just tell her Katya doesn't know how to sing. Like, she didn't take it seriously. And then later she said, yeah, probably it was like half a note or a quarter note false, but I can allow this to happen. I was actually surprised. But, you know, that's part of professionalism, is when you can let something slide and no, it's not a big deal. But okay. Before we get to very, very linguistic examples, let me give my own semi-linguistic example. It's not about translation, but it's about recording songs. As you know, I have or maybe don't know, I have a song channel called Magical Songs of the World. And I'm very meticulous about every single nuance, and it differentiates me from other people who try to do the same things. You know, my translations are better, at least I like to think so. Our performance is better. I demand from all the singers to have not necessarily impeccable or immaculate, but very excellent pronunciation. We produce them professionally in a studio. We create beautiful clips and so forth. So I was working with this amazing, talented Mexican singer by the name of Jessica, and we have worked together before. We had to hypercorrect. Actually, that's correct correction. We had worked together before. And I was being super demanding on a particular word. And the context of this is it was remote. I was in the US, she was in Mexico, and I didn't really take that context into account. Plus the fact that she just doesn't take correction very easily, she takes it very personally. And I think the mistake was that she was, the line of the song is, let me even look it up for you, sorry. It's from a beautiful song, pardon my little mouse here. I saw a real mouse running outside in Mexico. But it's from a song called Raven Eyes, a famous Russian song, Ochi Chorny. And it says, black and ardent stars, where all beauty lies. And Jessica was singing, if I'm not mistaken, black and ardent stars, where all beauty lies. And I was like, Jessica, where and were are not the same word. And she could not hear the difference. And for the life of me, I could not remotely get her to do it. In person, it's somehow easier. But I kept nitpicking on this point because I think that it's important. These are two different lexemes. I think I'm using the correct term here, right? And yes, from context, somebody might have figured it out, but I don't want people to have to figure something out from context. And after like tons and hundreds of recordings, I kind of know what I'm doing, but Jessica is like, you know, or she said in Spanish, eres exagerado, eres un extremista. Entonces soy un extremista exagerado de pronunciación. I'm an exaggerated extremist of pronunciation. I'll own it. Was this hypercorrection on my part? You know, yes and no. I was right to insist on it. Could it have been recorded with that imperfection? Maybe. You judge, but probably the main mistake was the context. Now, let me dive into the linguistic hypercorrection. Why is this even important? Because if you're an editor, or if you're a reviewer, or if you're a monitor, or a Czech interpreter, or a Polish interpreter, joking, Czech interpreter is like interpreting monitor. It is really important to know when to correct, when not to correct, and also if it's being done to you, it's important to know if it's a hypercorrection or a correct correction. Like today, I'll give you an example from today. We were discussing something, and I said something like altura promedia, and a native Spanish speaker corrected me correctly. She said altura promedio, and I was like, but why? Altura is feminine. Why would you say altura promedio? It doesn't make sense. They don't align. But she was right. And then I said something about promedio being an adjective, and she was like, it's actually a noun. And technically she's correct because grammatically it is a noun, but it's functioning as an adjective. So the second was slightly in the hypercorrection category, but not exactly, because grammatically she was right. It would be foolish of me not to admit it. Okay, I remember a time years ago when a lady asked me to write a song for a play she was producing about Mary Poppins, a Mary Poppins waltz. And I wrote this beautiful Mary, let me see if I can make an adjective out of it. Mary Poppinsian, no, that doesn't sound good. Anyway, a Mary Poppins waltz. And it had something like, da-da-da-da-da with the jam and the tea. And she was like, you're mistakenly using the English definite article there. It should be with jam and tea, not with the jam and the tea. And I was like, psh, you're asking me to write a waltz because I have native command of English and you're going to doubt my usage of articles? And in fact, both usages are correct. If you're implying that they're having it with evening tea or with tea that they normally have with their friends, you can definitely put an article there. But she had studied in Britain. So she knew better, quote unquote. And it ended up, you already know how it ended. She didn't get the waltz. She was like, you don't know what you're talking about. But she was just so set and stubborn in her ways that she couldn't accept the fact that I used a definite article when she wouldn't have. Well, that is definitely hypercorrection. Now, if I had been nicer, I could have said with your jam and your tea, but I didn't even think of that variant back then. And I didn't mean to be nice because she was being mean and I was being me. So that's definitely hypercorrection. And I'm not saying it because it happened to me. I probably have incorrectly hypercorrected someone before, but normally I own it and I say, this was a hypercorrect. Well, I don't use the word hypercorrection. I said this was wrong and you were correct, actually. I'll give you another example. This was recent. Let's call the lady Julia, although that's not her real name. And we were discussing, actually it was on Easter, and we were discussing what the proper reply would be to the phrase, Christ is risen. In Russia, like anybody knows the reply, even if you're not super Christian, Christos воскрес, воистину воскрес. And we were discussing if it should be truly he is risen, he is truly risen, he is risen indeed, and so forth. So I asked an American friend of mine who's actually an Orthodox Christian and an editor and a translator, very, very erudite guy, Kirk. It's all your fault, Kirk. I've told you need to work on your enunciation and delivery. No, I'm just kidding. See, Kirk is not a guy who tends to hypercorrect. He's very easy. And so he says in a message, he says, he is risen indeed. But the he was muffled, so I heard is risen indeed, but this made sense to me. Christ is risen indeed. It's fine. So I put it in the chat, and Julia says, tell your friend that he has bad English or like improper English or something. Well, clearly in English, sentences have to have subjects. Although there are exceptions to the rule. I can say, somebody can ask me, are you tired, Vladimir? Sure am. Where's the subject? It's not there, but it's proper English because it's conversational. I'm not a theoretical linguist, but in colloquial speech or in very elevated speech, we can sometimes stray from the standard norms of the language. So to me, and trust me, my Sprachgefühl, my sense of the language in English, he is risen indeed, sounded totally fine. But oh my God, this blew up into like World War III, and honestly into me being hounded because I disagreed. And I had to leave the chat and another chat, and it just turned into this whole big ugly thing because it is an example of hypercorrection. And it is also an example of having to be right at any cost. But what would be other examples of hypercorrection in linguistics or in life? I think I've already given an example of my court trial when the Russian lady, she was a witness in a very grave case, a felony case, and she said something like, to the question, would you take your husband back? She said, if he confesses, repents, and begs forgiveness, or begs for forgiveness. And in the moment, I didn't think of the word repent, so I said atones for. And then I thought that evening, should I correct myself? Because repent and atone for is not the same. Atone for has the connotation of actually doing something, but not necessarily repenting. Maybe you don't feel bad about it, but you do something. And repent does have a connotation of feeling ashamed, but maybe you don't do something about it. in the context of the testimony, really, it would not have mattered. But I corrected myself. If somebody else had corrected me, would it be hypercorrection? Not necessarily. It all depends on the context. Remember, let me give you another example. Actually, this is probably the best example of whether or not something is hypercorrection. Is telling somebody that they missed an Oxford comma hypercorrection? There is no right or wrong answer until you've asked in what context. If you're translating a book and you made a definite decision that you're going to use the Oxford comma throughout the book, then yes, it would be correct to put the Oxford comma there if you're the proofreader, but you don't even have to tell people, you just correct it. On the other hand, if you're talking to a girl and agreeing where to meet for the date and you tell her, oh, you know, Christine, I'm not sure I can go out on a date because you just missed an Oxford comma. Unless she's nerdier than me, linguistically, this will probably be a no date or a failed date, whatever you want to call it. You know, that's what we call pedantic. So I'm quite a pedant myself, but yeah. By the way, correcting pronunciation can sometimes be correct, or it can sometimes be pedantic. Like, for example, in English or in other languages, perhaps, many words have up to, like, I've seen a word in English that has up to 5 correct pronunciations. I don't remember what it is, you know, but you can definitely think of different varieties or different words in English. I'm not thinking of anything right now, but maybe. Specialization. I think some people from India might say that, or like different, obviously, varieties of spelling, theater versus theater, and center versus center. Sometimes British writers or translators will use an S instead of a Z, and so forth. Anyway, I think I'm rambling now. We probably need to end, but you get the concept. So when is it good to correct? When is it hypercorrection? Well, it depends on the context. What are you achieving with this correction? And is it making the result better? Or are you just... Also, the motive is important. 1, context. 2, is it going to improve the result? And by context, we mean the setting, but also, like, is this colloquial speech? Or is it lofty speech? You know, because I've seen, I love giving this example, but even Tolkien sometimes has a misusage of articles, except he's doing this on purpose. So it's allowed in literature, it's allowed in religious texts, it's allowed sometimes in slang, and then the most prim variety is like normal everyday speech, where everything is supposed to be by the rules. I never play by the rules. To heck with the rules, sometimes, if they're ethical rules. So, and 3, are you doing it out of a motivation to show that you're cooler, smarter, etc., or are you actually doing it out of a motivation to help? So these are the questions I think that we should ask ourselves before we correct. In fact, actually, I was just studying the California Code of Court Interpreters. It's an ethics refresher, and they gave a good example. I almost agree with it. In fact, I do agree with it. They said if you're working with a colleague and the colleague makes a mistake, first ask yourself, is this really going to influence anything, you know, in the big picture of the case? If not, just let it be. Maybe tell them during break. If it is, then say, Your Honor, blah, 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 needs to confer with her colleague and so forth, and discuss. If your colleague still stands, if they agree with your correction, let them correct themselves for the record, because it lets them keep their professional pride. I think that's a really good point. If not, if they don't agree and if they insist, then their version stands, unless you think it's crucial for the case, and then you need to let His Honor, Her Honor know that. I actually agree with that, except I would probably let the judge know anyways, even if I don't think that it's crucial for the case. I would just put it on the record for my own professional integrity. I would say, you know, Your Honor, I, as the interpreter, do not agree with my colleague's decision, but I do not think it's crucial for the case. Let it be, you know, and so forth. I think it's late. Before I ramble on too much, let's end off, but think about this. Write me your own examples of when you've been hypercorrected, when you have hypercorrected, And it can absolutely be in life, not just in translation or in languages. But I will actually, see, I'm just thinking of new examples. If you're coaching somebody on language, oh, this is crucial. Okay, I'm going to keep talking for a little bit more. If you're a coach, language coach, linguistic coach, any type of coach, your correction might be correct, but ask yourself this: by making the correction, am I going to help the person get better, more confident, more competent, or am I just going to introvert them? I'll give you an example. I love swimming. I'm not a professional swimmer by any means, but and I've taken some lessons from swimming coaches, and I remember one when I swam a lap in a 25-meter pool, and the guy at the end of one lap, he's like, you were doing this run and this and this and this and this, and he listed like 7 mistakes, and I'm like, oh my God, just give me one thing to think about. You know, you're just going to make my mind and other body parts, the mind is not a body part, blow up. So if you're a coach, you should not hypercorrect with quantity, you know. Or let's say that I'm coaching somebody on interpreting, and let's say that they're a newbie interpreter and they're hardly even keeping up in simultaneous, they can't even do it, and maybe they say, I don't know, some weird nuance, maybe they miss a definite article or an indefinite article. I will probably honestly just skip it, even if I notice it, and focus on the big picture. Like say, you know, if you get lost, just continue speaking, because in simultaneous it's important not to stop. And that's going to be my correction, not that they used a definite article instead of an indefinite article, you know? So it all depends on the context. But if I'm coaching a world-class interpreter, like me, or somebody else, then of course I'm going to pick on every single detail, but maybe even not if that's not what we're talking about. If we're working on their emotional delivery, I may or may not say, you know, like, George or Rachel, you missed an article. I might comment on it, but I would not emphasize it maybe. So I think this is really good for everybody: coaches, parents, linguists, teachers. Probably the best teachers are the ones who correct justly without hypercorrecting. You know, so now it's definitely time to end. I really want my apple and my Outlander. I hope this was useful. I hope whatever ships traveling in that Atlantic actually are able to correct their route correctly by using celestial navigation or whatever. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next clip. Good night, sleep tight, and know that you're always right. Well, maybe not, but it sounds like a nice rhyme.